The views and opinions expressed in the following podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the producers, the affiliates, or digital platforms hosting this podcast. All content is for the purposes of education, conjecture, and at times entertainment. We promote inclusiveness and diversity. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to Into the Deep with Jay Costa.
Welcome to Into the Deep. I'm Jay Costa. A blurry, seemingly bipedal figure emerges from either a forest or from behind a snowy mountain, only to just wander off back into the cover of those trees or mountains. It's an image that's been caught from the peripheral of thousands of human eyes. Whether they call it Sasquatch, Yeti, or Bigfoot, this elusive being has created its own legacy. And today's guest has some insight. He's a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University. He studies human evolution, survey of living primates, with a research emphasis on the evolution of human bipedalism. Today's guest is Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Dr. Meldrum examines and reconstructs the behaviors and the morphology from fossilized remains of our ancestors. And he happens to be one of the foremost Bigfoot researchers out there. We talk about so much in this episode, like how humans have adapted to walk on two legs. And gosh, you know what? Let's just get right into it. So join me as we seek light and journey into the deep with Dr. Jeff Meldrum. Enjoy. Thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Meldrum. I truly can't thank you enough. It's an honor.
Great. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks for the invitation.
Oh, our pleasure. And if you wouldn't mind sharing with our listeners and our viewers who you are and what it is you do.
Yeah. Well, I'm in this capacity, I'm a professor of anatomy and anthropology here at Idaho State University in Pocatello, Idaho, down southeastern Idaho. That means I teach human gross anatomy in the health professions programs, full body dissection, lab-based course, and as well as other anatomy courses in the various programs, and occasionally get the opportunity to teach some anthro in the anthropology department. So, some human evolution, survey of living primates, that sort of thing, which is always a fun distraction and change of pace. My research emphasis then, because of my emphasis in physical anthropology, is in the evolution of human bipedalism, how it is that we came to be adapted to walk on two legs instead of all four, or to climb in the trees any longer, any better than we do right now. That is, we still have quite a legacy that allows us to clamber about, and jungle gyms are an important element of any playground equipment for that reason, obviously. So, in that capacity, I examine and reconstruct the behaviors and the morphology from fossilized remains of our ancestors. That requires a lot of comparative data. So I conduct studies on both human subjects, but also non-human primate subjects, observational, the force plate, electromyography, etc. And of course, the footprints have taken on a real important role, obviously now, and as rare as they are for hominins in the fossil record. Oh my goodness, it's 1995, 96. In 95, I was invited, well, even roll it back even further, clear back to 1968, when I was a youngster living in Spokane, Washington, which happened to be one of the first venues that Roger Patterson publicly showed his documentary showcasing that 60-second film clip. And so as a young fifth grader, enthralled with biology already, natural history, insect collections, bringing snakes home and other wayward animals and so forth, to my mother's chagrin sometimes, this really embodied everything that I was fascinated in. I mean, in addition to natural history, I was fascinated by human evolution, by cavemen, by all things mysterious as well, and it just all rolled into one. And in this this image of a figure walking across the silver screen there, and I was enthralled. I mean, I really became almost obsessed with the study of this. And of course, at that time, there was very limited materials, very limited public knowledge. This was clearly the first time I'd ever heard of Bigfoot before. So that interest waxed and waned over the years. I learned a lot. I dug a lot. I got acquainted with the publications of Ivan Sanderson and John Green. You know, I was delighted when John Napier eventually published a book by a bona fide PhD primatologist. And but eventually it sort of plateaued, and it was rekindled dramatically when I was invited to comment on a piece of video footage that was shot in Northern California again. So we're back to Northern California, only this time it was shot from inside an RV filled with young people filming a cable TV show, sort of an adventure travel adventure kind of show. And I thought, oh, I was invited to evaluate it, thought this will be a fun exercise to expose the zipper and apply my, my hard-earned skills in comparative anatomy and locomotion. And I was taken aback because I couldn't find the zipper. And instead I kept noticing subtle details of anatomy and kinematics of the movement that were really quite intriguing and gave me, real serious pause. And then that just sort of snowballed into a number of things, which eventually led to my paying a surprise visit to a fellow that lived in Walla Walla that I had become aware of through a publication that depicted this sort of legacy of that region of southeastern Washington, northeastern Oregon. And as a result of that surprise visit, it turned out that he alleged to have discovered a set of footprints that very morning. I mean, this gentleman had quite a history, and that was why I was interested in talking with him. He had an extensive collection of footprint casts, many of which had figured very prominently in the writings of Dr. Grover Krantz. So sort of my predecessor in this narrow niche that I currently occupy. And so at his invitation, I was traveling with my brother. We went up and took a look at these footprints. And it just, literally took me aback. It set me back on my heels because I must say I was still harboring a lot of skepticism. I was, and I had been offered all sorts of friendly advice about the character of this gentleman, Paul Freeman. So I was very cautious, but here were multiple, 35, 45, a long line of clear tracks in the mud that were unmistakable. They either were real or they were hoaxed. There was no misidentification, no ambiguity if these were, just potholes or washouts or some other natural artifact. And so, I'm kind of pinching myself figuratively. How could he have done this? I was impressed with what I was seeing. There was clear evidence of a very animated trackway. That is, you could see the pressure ridges, the tension cracks, and so forth. It was interesting because I just got an email this morning from someone who was reading one of Tom Brown's books. Tom Brown is a renowned tracker and somewhat controversial in his approach and some of his claims, but nevertheless, he's written quite a series of books, some of which I've found very useful. But this one, the fellow who sent this to me, he said, "What about this?" there's a passage from one of his books where he says, Tom Brown says, several times people have shown me that they were what they thought were the tracks of Bigfoot, the legendary Sasquatch of the Pacific Northwest. It took very little study to discover that they were fakes. Why? There was no life in them. There was no variation in the pressure releases. I'm not saying Bigfoot doesn't exist. I hope it does. But so far, the Bigfoot tracks I've seen were made by pranksters, usually large men striding through the woods with stamps strapped to their feet. And he goes on, and this is is an astute statement. It's just misapplied. The difference between a stamp and a normal footprint is phenomenal. When a live animal's foot comes down, it ripples, it clenches, twists, and deforms the soil in so many wonderful ways that the track itself seems alive long after the foot has left its mark. That's really a very prosaic description of it, but he's spot on in that description. However, he's completely off base when it comes to the application of that attitude to the footprint evidence. Now, I have to acknowledge I don't know what he has seen, and it's very possible that the tracks that he was shown, as is the case with not that many. I mean, the outright hoaxes are few and far between. More often, there's ambiguity simply because of the poor quality of the track itself, the conditions, and so forth, or there's just overinterpretation of and misidentification. Bear tracks, the common candidate, because the hind foot is relatively flat or plantigrade and all 5 toes are in contact with the ground. But I suspect, because to my knowledge, and nothing he has ever said or written suggests otherwise, he has never had or had the opportunity or availed himself of the opportunity to examine an extensive trackway, because those qualified to evaluate them who have, at the very least, reserve a judgment or are quite intrigued, and would say the same things, just as because I don't want to toot my own horn, but on the other hand, I have credentials. And so when I tell you that I was impressed by this trackway outside of Walla Walla because of its animation, because of all of the things that he describes that are so phenomenal, to the trained eye, you can see this creature actually walking. You can imagine the foot progressing through that step, and so I was there was a moment, and I've said this repeatedly, but there was a moment when it was as if 2 little imps were on my shoulders, and one is saying, do you really want to, or asking, do you really want to go down this path? Because I was fully aware of all the grief and all the ridicule and persecution that Dr. Krantz had been the brunt of. On the other hand, the other little imp was saying, how could you not? How could you walk away from this? This is one of the most fascinating questions of science, and especially anthropology today. And this was not just your run-of-the-mill discovery of a footprint. It was a trackway. It was an animated trackway. It was a fresh trackway, so fresh that it still harbored signs of dermatoglyphics, skin ridge detail that was subtly preserved there in some of the tracks because of the very fine substrate that it was walking through, this very fine glacial loess that's predominant in the soils there in southeastern Washington and all the way down across Idaho. We're very familiar with it here. It's unfortunate when there's less vegetation to hold it down, then it gets carried away by the wind. And so we have dust, lots of dust in southern Idaho. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, and I certainly want it to be a two-way exchange here. But
this is fascinating. This is the stuff that I absolutely love.
Yeah,
and especially when you describe just how that print has life to it, and where you can see the creases and the ridges of the skin and everything else.
Yeah.
I would hope, most folks that would want to research are assuming positive intent. They're not going in there thinking first and foremost it's going to be a hoax, or maybe it is that. Maybe you go in with the preconceived notion that you're going in to debunk it, like you said earlier, looking for that zipper.
Right. Sure.
And then so now if you see evidence, that changes. Is that kind of more along the lines of how you approach that?
Well, certainly. I mean, in science, in the strictest interpretation of the philosophy of science, the and theoretical is not always practical, but theoretically, we're not able to demonstrate every affirmative case. We can't prove something by showing all of the positive results, and so it's more pragmatic if you can falsify, if you can show that one exception to your hypothesis, the generalization emerging from your hypothesis. And only then are you justified in elaborating upon your hypothesis, making it more complex. This is the age-old misapprehension of Occam's razor. Occam's razor doesn't assert that the simplest answer is most likely to be correct. It simply is acknowledging this systematic process, this of incrementally adding to the complexity in order to test your hypotheses and attempt to falsify them in an orderly fashion instead of a haphazard here and there and everywhere. So instead of jumping to the most complicated, Bigfoot is an interdimensional, shape-shifting, time-jumping alien from Alpha Centauri. There's a lot of variables added there, which if you roll all that back, we should start out with Bigfoot is, as it appears, a large bipedal primate that seems to be quite adapted to the montane forests of the temperate regions of the northern hemisphere, and so until you can falsify that, you're not justified to. So the approach, there is a role of it really isn't even a manifestation of skepticism. It's a you can, you're, as scientists, we always collect evidence that supports our hypothesis, but we're supposed to be looking for as well exceptions that may overturn our hypothesis. And so that doesn't mean that we're skeptical of it. It means that we want to understand it better and refine it. People who go out, in this age, the ideological skeptics, people who edit magazines called Skeptical Inquirer or Skeptics Magazine, who wear skepticism like a red arm badge, armband, is that they've missed the point. That's like approaching science like as a keyboard, and you're just going to sit there and pound one key incessantly. Not only does it not produce anything worthwhile or uplifting, but it also is really annoying. Those people are not very interesting to have around because they ignore everything else. They become so focused on their pet objection. It's like we had, here's an example. And I spoke recently at the University of Wyoming at the invitation of a member of the anthropology department. And I gave a little presentation to his classroom in a small group discussion. And then as part of the visit, I also presented to the entire campus community, and the public community was invited as well. And it was a pretty good turnout. There's a lot of interest, even though this was far over in southeastern Wyoming. Most of the action is over here on the western side of the state. But in any case, there was a point where there was a question from the audience, and it was actually from the department chairman. and he is a forensic archaeologist. So, I mean, his career is focused on the trace of activities of habitations and so forth in people's daily lives. So he was interested in that perspective, from that perspective. And of course, one of the common questions is, where's the physical remains? Where's the, from his perspective, where's the physical trace, the physical evidence of the presence of this entity? And I offered the apologist's explanation, which is a reasonable one. I mean, the first, I might as well, because I'm sure this might come up and your viewers be interested, but the first issue is the rarity of these creatures. There just aren't very many. I mean, some people are operating under the misapprehension that they're confabs of Sasquatch out in the woods. They get together for parties and so forth. No, they're not. They're probably extremely solitary in their movements and foraging and their behaviors, and very far ranging based on the repeat appearance of recognizable individuals on the basis primarily of their footprints. But even sometimes there are some that have been reported with distinctive color or a distinctive marking. And then you hear that other witnesses independently noting that same thing. And by plotting those on the map, you get an idea that they must have a pretty wide, and it makes sense, a pretty far-ranging home range, and on the order of perhaps as much as 1,000 square miles, which is quite respectable. And well, it seems a lot, but really, you stop thinking about it, it's 30 miles by 30 miles, basically.
Sure.
So it's really not, as a crow flies, to find tracks that are separated by 40 miles is not unprecedented at all.
Right.
So there's that factor. Then, of course, there's the natural history factors and the physical factors. The fact that we're talking about a large-bodied, long-lived primate. If we can extrapolate, well, both from suggestive evidence, again, from the repeat appearances of recognizable footprints, we have examples of adults that are on, are making their presence known over a period of several decades. So, if you add the developmental years on top of that, then you've got something that's at least 30, 40. I would suggest even more, because there's a positive correlation of longevity with body mass. And if you look across the great apes and humans, the life, including humans, but consider it from the point of view before civilized healthcare and nutrition and sanitation and so forth, 45 to 50, 55, 60, in that range, was common for humans as well as the other great apes. The oldest gorilla had been, and I've got to update my quick recall, but the oldest was Gorgeous the gorilla in the Salt Lake Zoo, 62 years old when she passed. But just recently, there was a YouTube video about another gorilla, and I honestly can't remember where, but it was 65, I think. She was celebrating her 65th birthday, and they had a big marzipan cake for her, and that she was gobbling down. So anyway, so there's those factors. Then there's also the physical factors. These creatures inhabit wet coniferous forests where the soils are remarkably acidic, and the preservation of bone is rare. I mean, you contemplate. We're talking about, let's just talk about here, my home state of Idaho. There's, I would estimate there's maybe between 75 and 100 Sasquatch, based on the available habitat and the potential home range that we're talking about. By comparison, there's 30 to 35,000 black bear. Now, you start thinking in terms of those scales, and I haven't even looked up the data for, say, deer in the state, but there's probably hundreds of thousands of deer, and yet, are we tripping over carcasses every year? One friend of mine did ask a DNR, wildlife resource officer in his home state of Minnesota, and they gave him a figure of 10 to 20,000 winter kill of deer annually.
Wow.
That's a lot. And so, but again, springtime, do you go out on your hike down the trail and trip over a skeleton here and find a skull there? No, they're processed remarkably well. So back to Wyoming, this department chairman had asked me these questions. I offered a little more abbreviated discussion or answer than that, actually. But that later that evening at dinner, in the conversation, he was just right across from me. And I said, by the way, I just meant to ask, did you find that answer, that response, apologetic though it was, at all satisfying? And he looked up and he said, no, I didn't. And rather than, dragging out the arguments again and laying them on the table, I just said, well, I find it quite interesting that people who adopt a rather skeptical position often have their favorite missing piece of data, and they focus on that to the exclusion of everything else. And he goes, everything else? What are you talking about? I go, I just about said, you were sitting there in my during my presentation. Were you listening? Or I didn't say that. I just said, well, I just said during my presentation there, I presented quite a bit. I from my perspective, from my experience and expertise, it would be the footprint evidence first and foremost that's the most compelling and by far the most prolific of evidence is there to consider. His response just floored me. Oh, I'm not an expert in footprints. I go, and then I did say, well, I am. I am. Don't you think that you should, that I deserve the deference of my expertise that I would offer you when it came to a question of forensic archaeology and the trace evidence? And that changed the tone of the conversation. There obviously the whole table was listening to the conversation, but I think they might have been taken aback slightly by my blunt response. But it was so transparent how biased. And I always have to, I think about those experiences because I try to self-reflect. All right, Jeff, what biases are you harboring, and are you looking at this? Are you looking at this with an open mind and with an eye that, willing to consider an alternate interpretation or an alternate point of view? And no one can do it perfectly. No one can be completely unbiased, but we're certainly the product of our experience. But it's interesting. It's interesting. I've had some give and takes with ideological skeptics out there. For example, Michael Shermer, there's a name that people recognize. He, because of my participation in this investigation, of course, my naysayers took every opportunity to create situations of confrontation and challenge and in an attempt to belittle and so forth. And so one of my most vocal critics was an instructor in the physics department, and he had arranged for Michael Shermer to come and speak to the physics department. But then there was similarly a university-wide presentation. And coincidentally, the director of the museum had made good on a promise she had made to me. There was kind of an interesting history of competition between regional museums here. And in order to prevent me from appearing to support another museum in another city here regionally, she promised that the exhibit that they had offered me the opportunity to develop on Sasquatch that she would do here at the Idaho Museum of Natural History on campus. So coincidentally, and to the chagrin of many people on campus, when Michael Shermer came, here's this big exhibit. I mean, not big, but here's the temporary transient exhibit on Sasquatch. But they had put this huge banner on the side of the museum building with a recreation of Sasquatch based on a interpretation of the image from the Patterson-Gimlin film, and with the words, how do we know? What she tried to do to sort of do an end run about rather than a frontal assault on it, she approached the subject from an epistemological perspective. How do we know things? What is knowledge? What is faith? What is belief? What is myth? And drew heavily on from Carl Sagan's The Demon Haunted World, which, has some qualities. But as soon as someone like even Sagan lumps Sasquatch in with parapsychology and UFOs and, transcendental meditation, then as far as I'm concerned, they have shot themselves in the foot. They don't have credibility. If they don't know the distinctions there, then how can you trust their discrimination of these other phenomenon and their evaluation? It's always frustrating. And that was exactly what was the case with Shermer. They were going to take him. One of the fellows who teaches, he's in the English department, and he teaches a class on pseudoscience. And of course, they have a lecture on Bigfoot about, of course, cryptozoology. And so he invited Shermer on a tour of the Idaho Museum of Natural History featuring the Bigfoot exhibit. So he calls me up and asks me if I would like to attend. And I said, sure, this will be interesting. Well, so I came prepared. I brought a copy of my book. And at that time, this even predated the explosion of literature, not all of which is on par with the past publications of serious investigators and academics. But if you were to count yourself as informed on the subject of Sasquatch, it would be fair to assume that you had read my book. And again, not touting my own laurels, but that's a reasonable assumption. I would expect that. But I took one just in case, and sure enough, he didn't have a clue. I said, "Have you seen my book, or have you read my?" "Oh, no." And I said, "Well, I thought that might be the case." Here, this is, here's the primer. And so how can you have any, I stopped short of challenging him, but the implication, I tried to make it implicit. How can you claim any type of authority in any statement about this subject? How can you write articles for Scientific American? And that's the other, this isn't the direction I meant to take this, but as you said, this is kind of freewheeling.
Yeah.
But one of my biggest gripes about people like Michael Shermer is the inane things that they say. Shermer wrote this article for Scientific American. And at some point, he said this column, it wasn't an article. He had a regular column in Scientific American. But one of the themes of his column on one occasion was the science starts, show me the body. It's kind of back, the old commercial. This may predate you, but with the little old lady in the hamburger joint, and she lifts
where's the beef?
Yeah, exactly. Where's the beef? You got to have some meat to your argument. And so he was saying the science starts once you have a body. Okay, well, I understand the thrust, this imperative for the physical specimen. And I fully acknowledge that. And I always have. I've never suggested that I'm out to persuade my colleagues on the basis of this evidence alone. But my argument is that's the most let's just say it, asinine statement I have ever heard. The science starts when you ask a question and apply the scientific method in an attempt to address and answer that question. If you sit around and don't do anything, how scientific is that? You wait for the asteroid or the meteorite to fall in your lap. We had an extension of that, in part on the heels of this visit. As I said, one of my most vocal critics was this instructor in physics department, and he likewise had a column. See, these people that gravitate to this type of skepticism are usually people who are very opinionated and have no qualms about sharing their opinions with everyone else, because, of course, theirs is the best opinion, right? So he has a column with an opinion on everything, and I became the punching bag. I was the easy target, the straw man, And so on one occasion, even his department chairman of the physics department chimed in. But basically, the theme was, they were rehearsing Shermer's adage, "The science starts once you have a body." So I wrote back a letter to the editor, and I said, it was a lengthy letter, but in short, it was, "Isn't this interesting? Coming from a pair of physicists," I said, "show me an atom, show me a black hole, show me a string." I said, most of the phenomenon that you are preoccupied with, you have no corpus delicti. There is no body, and yet you're studying the effects, the influence, the trace on its surroundings. And I said, doesn't that sound kind of similar to the kinds of evidence that I'm grappling with? So it's comical. It's comical in some ways. Anyway,
but it must be frustrating.
Well, it is. I mean, I'm to the point where I don't see it as an obstacle. And quite honestly, those who gravitate to that kind of an argument, they're not going to be swayed. They're not sincerely interested. They're not open-minded in the least. As far as, again, not swayed to persuade them, but swayed in the sense of acknowledging and that there is evidence and it is worthy of attention and engagement. And so I don't see them as a roadblock or an obstacle. I just step around them now. I mean, and I think that the weight of the evidence that I've presented, and the, it's kind of funny when there was a journalist who paid a visit, and she had done her homework a little bit and had asked around, and it was, she was quite blunt as well, and said, yeah, I've talked to a number of people, and there are people on this campus who think that you are just a joke. You're just a laughing stock. What do you say to that? And I said, well, I can imagine who you talked to. I said, have you looked at my book? And she hadn't yet. And I said, well, this is not as an appeal to authority, but just as to who her sources are of information. Because the book, I mean, that's why I asked if she'd read the book. I said, you need to grapple with the content of the book, which these others have not. But whose name is on the cover of the book with a glowing endorsement, not of the existence of, not advocating the existence of Sasquatch, but advocating the merits of a scientific investigation of a fascinating question of natural history. There's Jane Goodall. You know who that is, right? Open up. Who wrote the foreword to my book? George Schaller. You may not recognize him because he is an academic. He's an academic's academic. He's the natural historian of the century, basically. And so you should know, if you're writing a story about natural history, that's the problem, is most of the journalistic coverage comes from the human interest section, and instead of a good solid science or natural history perspective. But I said, here's George Schaller. Read what he has to say. And then in my paperback, you open it up, and there's 2 whole pages of endorsements from various academics, veterinarians, state wildlife agents, and on down, other professors of various disciplines of biology and anthropology. And I said, who did you talk to? An instructor in the physics department? Oh, yeah, I would take his opinion over that of a world-renowned primatologist any day, right? No, wrong. So it's when you have that kind of engagement in on your side of the fence, or in your arena, it's the silly remarks don't stick. You have a Teflon coat, in a way to speak. But the point is, though, more, like I said, not to appeal to authority or to individuals. It just shows that there are people with those credentials who have been willing to say publicly that they are very intrigued, they're impressed, that this merits scientific, and as Schaller said, I think it was long overdue. Why has this been delayed? Why haven't scientists stepped up to undertake this? So, and there's various reasons. Obviously, that's a whole other discussion. But in the end, it's the evidence. There is a body of evidence. I mean, it's like one of my past chairmen said to me, rather bluntly, that after all, Jeff, these are just stories. And I said, stories that leave footprints, that shed hair, that void scat, that vocalize, that are witnessed by competent, experienced outdoorsmen, etc., and agency personnel. That it's more than stories. Yes, the stories are there, and we would expect that to be the case. We would expect, if there is an entity, that it has a role in the narrative of the region, both the recent past events, but also the indigenous populations, that it would figure. And lo and behold, it does. It figures extremely prominently. And we had some examples of that. It was interesting. We there was a gathering, a conference of sorts held here in Pocatello just over this past weekend, and we had a surprise presentation by a Shoshone woman who wanted to share the Native perspective, her people's perspective, and she has a master's degree in archaeology and anthropology, and works for the Forest Service, doing site interpretation and evaluation, impact statements, and so forth. And it was very interesting to hear her perspective. It's not often the case that the tribal peoples are willing to share. We're in this, anti-colonialism fervor of late, and it becomes a delicate, touchy dance to have an intellectual exchange of ideas without all of the caveats and nods and virtue signaling that goes with some of the silliness today. No, I shouldn't say that. I don't mean to come. I should be more careful in how I say that. There are fundamental issues at play, but there's also extremism, which brings out the least productive behavior in those involved. So anyway, it's always refreshing when someone can just, can't we just all get along and share our ideas and move on together, acknowledging that things have happened in the past, but we can't change those. Neither of us can change those. So let's move forward.
Yeah. It's, especially with like some of the tales that we've heard about, all kinds of different creatures, obviously, they have to have had some seed of truth to them, I would like to think.
Yeah. Yeah. There was a friend of mine shared, he went to an IMAX theater program, and it had this big passage printed up there. There is no history without legend, and no legend without history. So you're right. We cannot completely divorce ourselves from the storytelling. That's how we assimilate, and that's how we incorporate our past history and experiences. But likewise, much of the legendary aspect, much of the folklore is, as you say, rooted in kernels of truth, of real experiences, and in some instances those real experiences can be traced, but in others, they disappear back in the mists of time, and we only have the projection of those events. And sure, they're a little distorted, a little embellished, a little elaborated upon, perhaps, but when it's very easy to compare the case studies of Sasquatch, of Wildman related stories and folklore, alongside the embellishments and elaborations that often form the trappings of surrounding otherwise mundane. A coyote takes on this really significant role in the legendary stories, the folklore of tribal peoples. The raven, some people would look at the raven as just a scavenger that eats carrion off the highway, roadkill off the highway, but yet it has all these other aspects. That doesn't mean that crows don't spend time eating roadkill. It's a biological organism, and anyway, you can still appreciate and recognize the significance that it represents. And the same thing with Sasquatch. I mean, and I'm always careful, because sometimes I've made the statement in the past that all of the representations are, in fact, based on, at least otherwise that we're familiar with, are based upon real creatures. There are obviously some very exotic creatures that maybe are entirely mythical and have no root in reality. In which case, then you have to acknowledge, well, are we interpreting the legends correctly? And I wonder about that sometimes, because when I hear the native perspective on some of their own stories, it can be quite different, even across just very closely juxtaposed tribes or peoples. And but that usually doesn't mean that, even if they have contrived some association more recently, like there are some who have challenged whether, for example, the Bukwas of the north is actually a Bigfoot, a primate kind of like creature. Not that they would historically or prehistorically have any concept of what a primate was, but instead the Bukwas is this kind of pasty creature that has emerged when someone gets lost at sea and drowns, and then comes up on shore kind of like a zombie. Doesn't sound much like it has much to do with Bigfoot. And yet I've talked to many tribal people who, in their minds, they are one and the same. That's their representation of Sasquatch, of what you call the Sasquatch, which isn't even their own term, to begin with. It's an anglicized term that is derived from a number of names that have sort of a common ring to them, a familiar or a common denominator of roots and derivation.
Yeah. So. I got to ask, in your opinion, we talked about, remaining open to possibilities or ideas. So, when you say that, how about the folks that maybe are leading either away from the, the flesh and bone version of Bigfoot, in flesh and bone version of Sasquatch?
Yeah, and it has become a very polarizing
Yeah.
split that and I can remember a number of years ago giving a presentation. It was in Hamilton, Montana, and the theme of my presentation was sort of what is the biology of Bigfoot? Is there a justification? And I made that point very explicitly at the end of the presentation, that we're at a fork in the road, and there's or the tracks, because I said, you want to be on the train that ultimately is that participates in the discovery and understanding of a new biological species. You've got to get your ticket now, because there's going to be very little bridge between the two, given the very divergent direction this other is going. And again, it boils down to the question of who's on the right train, and who's to say who's on the right train. And it becomes a personal decision, and so you have to decide: are you interested in pursuing a question by applying a methodology that requires objective documentation, demonstration of evidence, an evidence-based hypothesis? Or are you comfortable on the other side with, a very fanciful, speculative, subjective experience interpretation that is essentially impossible to replicate in a documentable fashion? I mean, some people claim to have replicated or experienced similar things, and they gravitate to one another, at least their description of their subjective experiences. But there's just so much that is about what they're doing that can't be. And in my own experience, again, a bias emerging from my own experience is that every time I'm anyway involved with those claiming such things, they either evaporate under the scrutiny of someone evaluating them objectively, or they just don't happen. They just never occur. The mind speak, the bouncing orbs, the this, that, or the other. And I know there are all sorts of claims. I'm still asking, where's the beef? All they can show me are the buns, but there's no hamburger patty there to sink my teeth into. So, and I try to assure people that I'm not prejudicial about it. I mean, I think it would be fascinating if we discovered that there's a race of beings that can step through a portal from another dimension and interact. It's always quizzical, the nature of the interaction. One of the surest ways to challenge someone who claims to have mind speak is just simply ask them, so what's the gist of your conversation? What kinds of things did the Sasquatch talk about? And more often than not, you get what I call the Miss America answer, the Miss America candidate, it's kumbaya, new age mumbo jumbo, or something out of a fortune cookie. Now, there was one person gave me a reasonable answer. Finally, at least it had some potential, I thought. But her point was, well, they don't speak our language, so what they're conveying are basically their impressions, their thoughts, and then the person receiving that has to put it in their own words. So when they express it, it may sound kind of funny because that person may not be very articulate or may not be skilled at sort of transcribing those mental impressions. I thought that makes more sense than the these strange new age vocabularies about striving for world peace, and you're destroying the planet, and you must be stewards, responsible stewards, and all that business. I mean, if their goal, if their purpose on this planet is to safeguard nature and to put humanity back on the bright path, I'm afraid I have to say that they're failing miserably. I mean, that's just not to sound gloom and doom, but I mean, it's just not. I think they've just been overwhelmed, if that's the case, by human irresponsibility. But anyway,
and they don't even have cell phones that we know of. So
that's right.
They're not scrolling on their social media that we know of.
Right. Yeah. No, it's so I'm approaching the subject as an anthropologist, as a biologist. And as I said, I have yet to experience or to be shown anything that has falsified the more straightforward explanation that what we're dealing with is a creature, a species that exhibits all of the adaptations that we might expect for a creature of this sort, this extraction, this phylogenetic history existing in the rugged mountainous terrain that we find them in. It's like I tell people, you look at that picture over my shoulder there, and even when as an 11-year-old seeing that, it just struck me. I mean, it was not like an image of Godzilla stomping through Tokyo. It was an image of a creature, an animal that was at home in its environment. It just seems so natural. And so, I mean, it's like spotting a gorilla on the Virunga Peaks, and as an ecotourist, that's kind of my impression. And so until such time as someone can demonstrate something convincingly that there are other dimensions to be understood. I've seen individuals who, it seems to me, are seduced into the paranormal arena because they become frustrated by the fact that there are no bodies, that we've been unsuccessful in demonstrating the ultimate conclusive proof that such creatures may exist, and that just that's a decision they've made. But I think that's the result of not understanding the principles, the ecological and biological and so forth, the principles that are there. As we were talking about, my apologetic explanation for the lack of a physical body, and to others that may be unsatisfactory. That may not be sufficient to explain, because there'll be the comeback, but we have bones and so forth, skins in museums of even these rarest of animals. But we're always making new discoveries. There are always new things that come to the fore that we didn't know just before. And so that argument in and of itself is not good. The lack of that evidence is frustrating. That's the frustration. I'm not frustrated by the skeptics, but it's frustrating that we're facing the challenge of trying to study an animal with all the characteristics that, if you ask anyone who studies exotic or rare endangered animals in the field, will agree are those that profile the most challenging species to study in the field. They're solitary, they're nocturnal, they're far-ranging, they're very generalized. they're intelligent. They're all those things make it a challenge.
And so, what advice would you give somebody who might just be starting out on their own research, maybe their own path of, pragmatic, systematic,
Right. Well, be sure you read my book. There's number one. And I tell people that if you contemplate the credible reports of encounters or footprint finds, are largely, at least encounters, let's limit it to that. Footprint finds, if you're diligent and get out there, you can find them. But encounters are by far and away by chance. They're happenstance. There's few examples, Patterson-Gimlin film being one of those, but they didn't just go out and on the first evening run into Sasquatch. They spent 2.5 weeks of difficult slogging, running the roads for miles and miles on horseback or in their truck. and the conditions were favorable to finding sign and footprints, and they were just lucky. So if you are only going to be motivated by immediate gratification, this is not the hobby for you. You have to enjoy the process. You have to be fascinated by the journey, because otherwise you will be frustrated. You will lose interest. I've said it's like me and fishing. I'm not an excellent fisherman, not much of a fisherman at all. But when I ever have fished, if I catch a fish early on, then I'm hooked. See, it's like that. That's why after 28 years, I caught my fish on the first time out, basically, with that remarkable, exceptional set of footprints. That was the fish. And so once I've caught a fish, I can sit there for the whole afternoon and wait for the second one. But if I sit there and after an hour, 45 minutes, or an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, and nothing, well, I don't last that long. If I don't catch a fish after 15 minutes, 20 minutes, then it's like, there's got to be greener pastures around, but better fishing holes somewhere. Let's go find it. And so I pull up stakes and go. And so if you're like me and you don't have that fish story to start the whole thing out with, then you need to really enjoy. And I do enjoy. I shouldn't say that I don't. I mean, being out. What better excuse could you have to get out into nature and if the Bigfoot phenomenon does nothing else but motivate an entire generation of people to spend all kinds of time tromping around in the woods and camping and exploring and etc. And then determine a location if you can, if you're fortunate enough to be near an area that has potential as Sasquatch habitat. And the rule of thumb that I suggest, and it's not just plucked out of the air, but it's based on studies that have been conducted and published. There's a published paper, one at least, that shows the remarkable congruence between bear habitat and Sasquatch. Makes perfect sense, not a surprise, but to actually see it demonstrated and worked out in a systematic way was very compelling. So if you're in an area where there is bear habitat, there is a possibility there might be Sasquatch as well. You want to kind of confirm that with a study of the reports that have come out, networking with local people, agency personnel, and law enforcement, so forth, if you have those opportunities. And then work those areas. Because like we said, it's kind of like a lotto ticket. You're not going to, but as rare as a win with a lotto ticket will be, you won't win unless you buy lots of tickets. So the more time you can spend in the field, the more your chances of success are increased. And and then learn the regional natural history. Take tracking courses, take plant identification classes, and look at the distribution of the edibles and medicinal plants that are in the region, and where do the other wildlife hang out. This is the thing. When you have someone who goes out on a weekly basis, and every weekend they have Bigfoot activity, as it's termed, which usually means some bump in the night or an alleged wood knock or something like this, and yet they don't see a coyote or a fox or a rabbit or a deer or a bear. What are the odds that they're going to see that extremely rarer entity, namely a Sasquatch? And so I often catch myself with that thought when I'm out, and you're sitting here thinking, why don't I see something? I mean, I spend all this time out here. Why don't I see a Sasquatch? Why don't I bump into one? I'm out here at night. I'm doing this and that, whatever, in the daytime looking for tracks. And then it occurs to me, what was the last animal that I saw out here? Am I bumbling around so much that I haven't developed the skills? So hunting skills and how to sit in the blind, how to descent your clothes. I mean, you're not going to hide yourself from Sasquatch, I don't think, just as it's very challenging to hide yourself from any other form of wildlife. But if you're, and then having said that, on the flip side, the other alternative strategy is to make your presence known, make your presence inviting to a somewhat intelligent, curious animal, and either with the presence of cooking food or bright colors or whatever, instead of trying to hide, trying to blend in. That's why it's funny how sometimes you see the enthusiast and they look like some paramilitary operation out there. I'm all for wearing drab. I mean, because it's just less obtrusive and less offensive to the eye to when you're out in the woods to dress accordingly and behave accordingly. But on the other hand, there's something to be said for hiking and talking, singing, whatever, to attract attention. And maybe you'll get a visitor to camp to find out what's going on. Anyway.
I love that.
Yeah.
Where can folks find you?
Well, the easiest place probably is my Facebook page, which is under my full name, Don Jeffrey Meldrum. And I try that. That is not a personal Facebook. It's more. I didn't know how to create a celebrity or whatever they call the term for a regular page. But I use that as a bulletin board basically for posting things, upcoming events, and articles that I've come across that are interesting that I'd like to share, or other discourse that has occurred. So that's a good place to start. My publications are available on Amazon, or also Paradise K is the publisher of my field guides and my and I do wanted to plug. I've done a series of booklets, activity and learning booklets for young readers and learners, and had the good fortune of hooking up with a excellent illustrator. And so although it's gauged for reading, beginning readers on up, the adults will find it interesting as well. I don't want to eliminate for people thinking it's just for kids, but it has, the potential for coloring. It has mazes. It has matching and word puzzles, and it has stickers. So I started off. I've always wanted to do something like this, and did a Sasquatch edition. Had so much fun with that before the artist was even finished with the Sasquatch one, I'd already drafted the Yeti edition. And so he just said, well, keep them coming. And so we did all 5 potential relic hominoids, including the Yowie, which was a real challenge. It was kind of fun to do for me, because there's well, the page on footprints says it all, and it has a whole collage of various footprints attributed to the Yowie, and no 2 are the same. No 2 have the same number of toes. Some have divergent big toes, some don't. Some look like a giant kangaroo or something. It's just, there is no consistency, which really raises an interesting question about what is the nature of the Yowie, because the others, not only is there a rather consistent footprint record, but the footprints are quite distinct and agree with what those creatures assert to be. And so, like the Alma's, its footprints look just like the preserved cave footprints of the Neanderthal, and the abominable snowman, the Yeti, the most credible footprints, ignoring the anomaly of the Shipton footprint, but they have divergent big toe like an arboreal ape. And we think that the Yeti doesn't live in the snowfields of the high alpine elevations, but rather its footprints are found when it crosses the snowy passes from one temperate forested valley to the next. So this relic ape species is essentially arboreal, much like a gorilla or a chimpanzee. And the footprint looks like a chunky chimpanzee with stout, shorter fingers, but a divergent, more thumb-like big toe. Anyway, and so on. And but see, it's easy to get me going down various paths.
This is great.
So the 5 set can be purchased or individually from Paradise K or parak.com, a publisher in Arcata, California. One other thing I would plug is for those that want some current meat, some beef. I edit an online scholarly refereed journal, the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, with the assistance of an editorial board, and it's so it has a narrow focus. But we've got we average about 175 to 250 pages a year. We're in our 12th year.
Wow.
It has research articles, in-depth essay-style reviews, commentaries, historical items and translations of difficult to obtain works like those of Mary Jean Kaufman, the Russian investigator who studied the Almas extensively, and so on, and lots of response and dialogue and interaction between authors and commentators. So that's found at www.isu.edu/RHI for Relic Hominoid Inquiry. If you Google Relic Hominoid Inquiry, you'll get there right off the bat. So that's a great source. And while it is a scholarly journal, and we do have scholarly academic standards, it's accessible. Especially the editorials and essay style papers are very accessible and profusely illustrated, since we don't have the constraint of a print journal with page limits and page costs. I push authors to repletely illustrate their writing, and so good high resolution images to go along with those articles. So it would be very edifying to your viewers. Yeah,
absolutely. And I also couldn't implore people enough to check that out. Definitely,
Great.
George and I have perused that many a time.
Oh, good. Very good. Thanks. Appreciate that.
Absolutely. Well, this has been awesome. I really can't thank you enough just for your space, your energy, but just like the work you've been doing for decades now, and just your pragmatic approach and just your passion, and just thank you for fanning that flame in a lot of other people.
Well, and I apologize that to your listeners too, that we kind of got down the rabbit hole of skepticism and all that, and I aired some of the dirty laundry. Sometime we'll have to get together and just focus more specifically on the fundamental issues and questions of the science, the current state of knowledge and understanding, and the evidence for the existence of Sasquatch.
And there you have it. I can't thank Dr. Meldrum enough for all his time, energy, and just all the research he's done for decades. If you'd like to find out more, you can find him at facebook.com/don.j.meldrum. Also, be sure to check out the Relic Hominoid Inquiry at isu.edu/RHI. If you're listening to the podcast, we hope you take a moment and rate it. We're still a new podcast, so you rating it actually helps us reach more people. If you're watching, take a moment and like the video and leave a comment below. Let us know what your thoughts are. Do you believe in Bigfoot, Sasquatch, Yeti? What are your thoughts? Be sure to hit that notification bell so you can find out about our new bi-weekly release. Thank you so much for watching, listening, and all your support. Till next time, take care of one another and keep thinking for yourself.